welcome to Flute Unscripted, Elizabeth Rowe.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm delighted to be here.
It's a pleasure to have you. There's a lot that I want to cover, some of it not even flute related necessarily, but this is Flute Unscripted at the Flute Center of New York. So I do want to, while I have you, talk about your flute career as well, and talk about the BSO, which I think is what a lot of people know you for, is your position there with them. You've been playing with them for a very long time now. You've been the principal flutist with the Boston Symphony Orchestra since 2004. Everyone in the flute community knows what a coveted and hard to fill position that was. So can you kind of talk us through your audition experience there and your nerves in that process?
Absolutely. Yes, so this position had become a little bit legendary in the flute community, as you referred to, because it had been difficult to fill over a couple different periods of time. And as I was growing up, that was kind of what I had always known about the Boston Symphony principal flute position. So when I found myself, I was 29 years old when the position was advertised, and I was really quite happy with where my career was at that time. I was associate principal flute with the National Symphony Orchestra in Washington, D.C. My husband was playing in that orchestra as well, and we had bought our first house and really were settling into life in Washington, D.C. and loving it. And this audition came up, and it was one of those things where my goal was to really represent myself to my maximum, to play my heart out, to do everything I could to represent myself fully. I thought I would be incredibly proud if I could get to the final round. And then my assumption was that would kind of be the end of it, that there would be no hire. They might hire someone, but I didn't imagine that it would actually be me. So when I approached that audition, I was really coming at it from a kind of a place of measuring it against my own internal goals, as opposed to some sort of external result. I had kind of released myself from any hope or expectation that the audition might actually go my way, and I really focused on performing for myself. So
kind of lowers the stakes a little bit, right? Probably
it does lower the stakes.
Place to come to an audition from. Yeah,
it is. And it's rare to take an audition from that point of view, because most of the time when we're auditioning, we really, really, really want the job. And this isn't to say that I didn't want the job, but it's sort of, I was in a different headspace at that time. And so I was able to approach the audition, as you said, just with a little bit, I just reframed the goals for myself a little bit, and that was quite helpful. So, I'm not pretending that I wasn't nervous. I was definitely nervous for sure. But it had a little bit of a different feeling about it than perhaps auditions earlier in my career had.
And how was the process? All the different rounds, and as you kind of get through to the finals, you realize, oh, wow, this might happen.
Yeah, it was pretty dramatic. I was invited to start in the semifinal round. So I started partway through the process, and most of what my response was during the course of the audition was just the extraordinary acoustics of Symphony Hall and kind of what it felt like to play that music in that space. So as the audition kept going and I was passing through subsequent rounds and the numbers were getting smaller and smaller, and then I found myself in the sort of final round with just two other people, again, at that point, it started to seem more possible that I, might end up with the job. But even so, I was really kind of focusing on staying in the moment, and especially in that really glorious acoustic that exists in Symphony Hall. That helped me, because I just truly had a joyful experience being able to essentially kind of relish that acoustical environment at that time.
I feel like that's kind of rare too, because there's a lot of auditions that we take where it's a really crummy hall or a bad room and it's dead and stuffy and it feels really uncomfortable and really miserable to play.
Right. Or the worst, which is that you're warming up in a really great room and then you get on stage and it's terrible. And this was the other way around. We had to warm up in those Wenger rooms, those little modules, those practice room modules that are just dead, and everybody sounds terrible in them. So you'd be kind of practicing and warming up in that room, and then walk into Symphony Hall and there's just this glorious sound. So it's kind of an ideal ego boost on the way.
Yeah.
It's working in the right direction for that particular audition.
And then you kind of lucked out too, because you got the job. And then, I mean, you just talked about your husband plays in the symphony with you, and you were already playing together. And you're both able to make this move to Boston, which is so fortunate.
Yeah, we've been really exceptionally lucky and have worked really hard both to make this possible. But a lot of the luck comes with, first of all, my husband is a violinist. And so just by nature of the instruments, there's going to be more positions open for the violin. There are so many musician couples where it's two flutists or a flutist and an oboist or a flutist and a trumpet player. And just the odds of two positions being open at the same time in the same orchestra are so slim anyway that it just becomes much more difficult. So we were able to work either in the same orchestra or in the same town. We have been able to basically the whole time that we have been together. I will say though that he left his job with the National Symphony to come to Boston to be with me without, it was about a year and a half that we lived in Boston before he joined the orchestra. So there was a period of time where we had no expectation also whether that would be possible too. And so we have some experience of what the challenge can be like that for a relationship and on a personal level when you make a big move like this in support of one person's career.
And then how did you know that was kind of the end of auditioning for you? I feel like you already had a pretty sweet gig before. And I imagine a lot of people, once they have, feel pretty settled somewhere, you said you were happy in the DC area. What makes you like ready to uproot again?
Yeah, it's a great question. Well, I mean, to be honest, when I took the audition for Boston, I didn't expect I would be uprooting. So, the way I looked at it was that, this was such a special opportunity to audition for the Boston Symphony. Mm-hmm. I felt intuitively that the sound of the orchestra, and the way I approach playing the flute were a good match. So I thought if I was going to take an audition for a big position, this was a good one to do. But then upon arriving here, and then with my husband also getting a position within the orchestra, I had no desire to make any further changes and would not want to roll that. I would not want to roll that dice again either. I mean, really, yes. So I felt exceedingly lucky, and both on my own behalf and then on the behalf of the two of us. So that was about as far as I wanted to push it.
Yeah. And so now you're 17 years into your tenure with the BSO. How do you bring a fresh approach now that you're a seasoned player to all the big solos? I think I just heard some recordings of you on Daphnis. So that they sound fresh, even when they are something that are kind of like in our bones and so familiar?
That's a great question. And that is something, to be honest, that I struggle with. In many ways, that one of the privileges of playing in an orchestra like this is that we play those big war horses and those really famous works, a lot, because we have such a substantial season. We put on so many performances that it's inevitable that we return to Brahms 4 and Daphnis and all of these pieces, fairly regularly. So in a different orchestra, Daphnis might come around every 6 or 7 years. And there was a stretch of time here where I think we played it in Boston, 4 performances in a week, which is our usual schedule. And then at Tanglewood once, and then on tour or something, it was packed in. And then the next year it was the complete ballet instead of just the suite. But, so we had a lot of Daphnis for a long time. And I do remember that it can be a struggle to find that kind of fresh inspiration and to approach it anew. What is incredibly wonderful about, and again, privileged about my job is that, we work with a lot of different conductors. We're exposed to some really extraordinary musicians, including my own colleagues on stage, but soloists, guest artists, and guest conductors who always bring a fresh approach and something different. So even if it's not that specific conductor for that specific piece that is prompting a new approach, I might be thinking, for example, about having played Debussy Afternoon of a Faun 2 months ago with the French conductor and having a completely radical new approach to that, thanks to that conductor. So then when I'm approaching Daphnis, I think there's sort of the residue of that in my imagination, and that helps me quite a lot to think fresh. So I guess I would say that I look for a lot of inspiration from those around me and from the diversity of folks that we come into contact with.
Were you at all kind of worried about those relationships that you have with your colleagues and the rapport that you have in that aftermath of the equal pay lawsuit that you did file against the BSO?
One of the things that has been a through line for me through my whole career and remains to this day is that I put a big premium on my relationships with my colleagues. That doesn't mean I'm best friends with everybody, or that, we're all having these amazing 100-person, dinner parties every Friday night or anything like that. But that I really am committed to and invested in having real, honest relationships with my colleagues to the extent that, is possible within an orchestra. But so I think anytime something really major like that lawsuit happens, it inevitably will test relationships and put a strain on that. And yet I had and continue to have really healthy, strong relationships with all of my colleagues. And that's not something that I've developed, so that I could withstand a lawsuit, but it's just part of my part of my philosophy around how I come to work, how I show up, and what I value and what is important to me. I think also about all the hardships that any of us could face in the course of a career, whether it's health challenges or divorce or, the loss of a family member, all these kinds of things that happen in our lives. To be able to at least have enough substance in our relationships with our colleagues that there's some care there, there's some trust, there's some depth to the relationship that I think serves us all really well in the long term.
And I feel like a lot of that is a part of having tenure as well, a sense of that security and that lasting, relationship that you'll have with your colleagues and the orchestra. Can you talk a little bit more about, you have a program where you kind of delve a little bit more into tenure track and how to achieve that? I feel like a lot of people don't talk about that side of things. You want to get the job, but you forget that you have to keep it also. So why is this program, this course important to you, and why do you think everyone should know about it?
Yeah, it's such a great question. And this program really was born out of two things. It came from my own personal experience with the tenure process, specifically here in Boston, which was very, very difficult for me. I received a lot of critical feedback. I felt a lot of pressure, a lot of scrutiny, which is common for that process. But I struggled quite a lot. And even though I was well into my career, very well equipped, had a lot of skills, both, artistic skills, but also personal skills, communication skills, all of that, it was an exceptionally grueling and lonely time for me. Then fast forward, a little bit later on, and as I started to have more and more relationships with early professional musicians, either former flute students of mine or musicians who I met through the Tanglewood Music Center or through the New World Symphony, I noticed that more and more of them were really struggling with this process too. They either were walking into an environment that they weren't prepared for, or they didn't really understand how to equip themselves well enough in advance. There's not a lot of talk about this, as you mentioned. It's so much of the focus is on winning the job, and that in and of itself is such a huge hurdle and then such a big accomplishment that we tend to kind of think that the rest of the story will just play out and it will be fine. But very often the tenure process is harder than the audition process because it's more complex. There are more factors that we have to think about. We have to think about our playing, but we also have to think about communication. We have to think about stepping into the role.
Like a people pleaser, but also sticking to your voice. I mean, that sounds
you bet.
Well, yeah.
You bet. And for me, when I started my job here in Boston, I was relatively young. I was a woman. My dear esteemed colleague who was the second flutist of the Boston Symphony at the time, Fenwick Smith, he had been essentially my teacher at Tanglewood, not that many years before. And to have to navigate how you assume a leadership position and yet also acknowledge that there are people around you who have a lot more experience and have wisdom to share. And yet you are in this leadership role. And so there's a lot of complexity to think about. Also, most orchestra musicians, we aren't really trained, taught, or equipped how to support people through the tenure process, how to offer feedback that is actually useful, how to be thoughtful as an organization about what our values are when we bring somebody on board. So most orchestras aren't particularly skilled at running the tenure process in a healthy and transparent way. So when you combine all of this, I feel like there's this profound lack of understanding and lack of skills on both sides of the equation in this process. So after many, many conversations supporting younger musicians as they navigated this process, and also reflecting back on how difficult it was for me here in Boston, it seemed to me that there was an opportunity to start to try to whittle away at this problem and to try to create something to solve it. So I formed a very small group coaching program to support musicians who are either in their own tenure process or contemplating, facing that in their new future. And the idea is to both focus on skills and tools, and also address the community, the sort of building a sense of team, building a sense of having a safe space where you can actually talk freely about your experiences, and know that you're not alone. So that was really my intention when I launched this program. I call it Your Tenure Team, because that's what I really want to build.
Do you have any advice for anybody else that might not be on the tenure track but just wants to communicate maybe a little bit better with their colleagues or offer constructive feedback in a positive way?
It's an enormous question. We could spend an hour talking about it, but I think that we want feedback. First of all, we have to ask ourselves, what is motivating our desire to offer feedback, and we want to think about really our goal should be to serve the music. So if we're going to offer feedback in a way that is unclear, confusing, or put somebody on the defensive, that tends to not actually serve the music. So if we are looking to, for example, address maybe a balance issue within the section, right? We want to think about asking somebody in the section to play louder or softer or something like that. There's a lot of ways we can do that put people on the defensive, and there are other ways that are more invitational, that are more collaborative, even to change your language from play softer to let's try it this way. It's just a very different kind of feeling. So a lot of it just has to do with some subtle, but I think useful shifts in language. And also when we offer feedback, it's so important that it be clear. It's so common to get feedback like, I don't know, there's just something about the way you do it that just, I don't know, it feels a little smushy. Or, I got feedback one time that was, that magic that you're making, I'm just not sure that it's your magic. So I thought, well,
yeah.
Thank you, I think. I don't know. And what would you like me to do differently? Right. So, yeah.
You also have a whole other side to yourself and your career that you ventured into, coaching and mentoring. It's a business in its own outside of your job. So can you talk a little bit about the logistics there, establishing yourself as an LLC, what resources were given to you to help you kind of launch this side of your career? What tools do you still use today? Did you ever seek the advice of a coach?
Oh, goodness. Yes. Okay. Many questions, and it's a great subject. No, so I'll try to work my way backwards. Yes, I'm working with two coaches right now. I've been working with coaches on and off for a long time, which is partly how I came to understand this particular modality, which is not teaching, it's not therapy. There's kind of a spectrum between mentorship and coaching and consulting that people can kind of float along that spectrum, but it's what I'm most interested in is, well, I should back up and say my coaching work falls into two categories. So one is more specifically directed at supporting musicians through this tenure process, where there is a lot of, I'm imparting knowledge and skills, and part of it is kind of more like teaching. And there's a component to it which is a lot oriented towards mindset, towards our internal landscape, towards understanding how we can be in the world in a more optimal way, in a way that serves us, that feels more in alignment with kind of how we want to be. So the other piece of my coaching business is one-on-one coaching work, and that I do with both musicians and non-musicians. And that is less about teaching, and it's more about what we would call thought partnership. It's about, my role is to ask the kinds of questions that helps my client think more clearly, think more courageously, break through some internal narratives that we all have about what is and isn't possible, what we should and shouldn't be doing, that kind of thing. So what I realized a number of years ago is that I have been doing work that is very much along these lines for quite some time without really naming it, without kind of understanding that that's what I was doing, and that work is some of the most gratifying and inspiring work that I do. And I began to realize that work, in many ways, I feel like is able to have a greater impact on the people whom I'm in relationship with than teaching the flute, for example. And all power to great flute teachers out there. And I love teaching the flute, and it's an incredibly important, obviously, role to fill. But for me, in terms of my own impact, I began to feel really strongly that my impact is greatest in this other space, which is this coaching space. As far as setting up an LLC and all of that, boy, just the nuts and bolts of that, I've had a little bit of help and advice about, how to and why to, but a lot of it is just making sure that I'm keeping my business kind of clean and in integrity. I'm not blurring my coaching work from my work with the Boston Symphony and all of that. So I keep it really nice in these nice separate buckets. But that's definitely been a learning process for me, the business side of things, for sure, which is why I have a business coach.
There you go.
Yeah.
You feel like your flute teaching has kind of taken, at least at the very moment, a little bit of a backseat to what you're doing now?
Yeah, I have intentionally, I have only so many hours in the day, and want to make sure that I'm, again, kind of putting my energy where I think it serves the most people with the most impact. And so I closed my private teaching studio at the end of 2020, and am stepping away from my teaching duties at New England Conservatory as well. So all of my work at this point that isn't performance is in this other coaching space. So at the moment, I don't believe I have any more flute classes, master classes, or lessons on the calendar. And I think the last master class that I offered I was a guest of my teacher, Jim Walker, for his studio. Yeah. And so that was an absolute joy. It felt like a very full circle kind of moment, that there was my teacher and there I was. And I was thinking, wow, this is maybe my last, or it's certainly the last masterclass I'll do in the foreseeable future. So it's a beautiful
nice way to kind
moment.
of close that chapter. Yeah.
You bet.
I did watch a little bit of interviews of you and performances, kind of when I was reading up on you and learning a little bit more. I found a lot of things from decades ago now, some stuff from 2010. You really seem to, I think, carry yourself a little bit differently these days from video interviews back then. You certainly just have a certain way about you that's a little bit different. So do you notice that difference? Do you feel different from your 2010 version? And do you have any advice for your younger self?
Yeah. I mean, I guess, of course, I feel different, but I imagine that we all would after the passage of a decade, most likely. I'm a little bit afraid to ask you what you noticed the differences in this.
I think you seem more like exuberant and maybe outgoing now, like a little less reserved, more open.
For sure. And, part of what I think some of that comes with age and just becoming increasingly more comfortable in your own skin. Part of that is as a result of me learning really within the last 5 years, the value of sharing one's own story, being seen, being known as a more complete person. And I think for a number of years, really beginning with my very difficult tenure process with the BSO, and given the fact that, very often I would find myself on stage, especially with the Boston Symphony chamber players, is the only woman in this small group of principal players in the orchestra. So a combination of feeling a lot of scrutiny from the tenure process, added scrutiny from kind of standing out as the only woman in this group, my own tendency to be a bit of a perfectionist, and my own—
Go away.
Does that ever go away?
Yeah, perfectionism.
I'll tell you a story. So I think it's a work in progress. But we can be thoughtful, I think, about learning to develop tolerance for our own imperfection and putting our mind to that as a goal. So an example that I can share with you just in my own recent history is I was asked to do a recital for the Mid-Atlantic Flute Convention, which the convention I think officially took place in February, but it was a pre-recorded recital. It was a 30-minute recital of unaccompanied flute music. So I was really thinking to myself about, in this Zoom era, everything is pre-recorded. In this social media era where there's this facade of kind of flawlessness and perfection that we can kind of put out there if we so choose, it was really tempting for me to put on a recital that felt like it rose to those standards of really produced, polished, as perfect as I could make it. And I noticed myself being kind of both drawn to doing that, and also a part of me thinking, well, this doesn't really serve the audience in a way, because if we were not in a pandemic and if this were live, you'd get a live performance and I'd have a coughing fit in the middle of something, or I would squawk on something, or I would mess up on a run. And so I made a goal for myself, which was my own personal goal, but was to record the recital in one take, no stopping, and just let it be. So I did it. I drank water between the pieces. I talked a little bit. I recorded it. I made mistakes in every single piece, including things like the C.P.E. Bach A minor sonata, and I would go along like, oh, that's an interesting note. And here we go. And, on the one hand, it might be easy to say that, okay, I'm principal flutist of the Boston Symphony. I can make a mistake. Nobody's going to, fire me or something.
Right.
The other flip side to that coin is that I'm the principal flutist of the Boston Symphony, and I should be putting out, the highest of the highest standards.
Yeah.
And so for me, that was an opportunity to practice tolerating my many errors, and not just tolerating them, but understanding that by presenting that recital in that format, it was an opportunity for me to model a certain kind of refusal to succumb to that perfectionism for others, and also an opportunity for them to see that I'm by no means perfect or flawless, even remotely, and whatever good that might do to help other people kind of put their own challenges into perspective, I think is valuable. And also the final thing is to at least contemplate the idea that maybe perfection isn't the goal of music making, and that maybe those flaws aren't by definition detrimental, that maybe they add some humanity to the performance that is more beautiful than a completely flawless performance. So this is my journey that I'm on. Yes.
I can resonate with that. I'm also kind of curious to hear your thoughts about identity as a musician, especially during this last year when a lot of people found themselves out of work. But I think it pertains to other sorts of people, maybe aging musicians, that are retiring, or musicians that decide they want to change career paths and do something else also. So maybe you have some insight into this in launching a business and having these dual sides to your career. So what ties musicians together, and what makes the identity of a musician?
Such a great question. And I don't know that there's one single answer to that question for everybody. I do see this though as a really I see this though as a question that is relevant at all stages of our careers. So early on, when we are graduating from music school and we're looking forward into our future, you know, there can be this idea that there's one way that our lives have to look in order for us to qualify as musicians or to define ourselves as musicians. And which can often mean I earn a full-time living being a musician, I have a job in X level organization, I do, and I think that there's a lot of room for a more expansive understanding of what being a musician is, and whether or not we choose to connect that with our livelihood or not. I don't believe we are less of a musician if we also are, for example, working a side job that pays our rent. Or if, I don't believe we are more of a musician if we have a full-time job with the Boston Symphony versus a kind of portfolio career that is some teaching and some freelancing, and maybe also working a half-time job in a mortgage company, or, there's, to my mind, each of us have to make a decision about how we choose to define ourselves, and to not allow the outside world or somebody else's definition to impose itself on us. I think it can be a struggle at various points in our career. Certainly in the pandemic, for people for whom their primary, interest and occupation and passion and job were all bundled up into a performance career, and that went away, it was a huge shock. I think that shock can also occur, as you mentioned, towards the end of career, when we are contemplating stepping away from that. And then the question is into what? So I think what can be valuable at all stages of the career, pandemic or not, is to stay open to, and not open to, but just to stay invested in all the other aspects of our lives that enrich us and nourish us and fulfill us as human beings. And so that can be other hobbies, that can be relationships, that can be ways in which we do music that aren't directly tied to furthering our career or making money, but are ways that fill us up, and that we get joy from. And so I think there's not enough conversation among especially in music schools, to make space for all of this, and to also encourage musicians to devote as much energy into the rest of their lives as they do into, winning the job or getting the gig and all of that.
Yeah. And I guess I just want to kind of know what's next for you. You're very busy, you're doing a lot, accomplishing a lot. So do you have any goals for the future? I imagine you must be like a goal setter sort of person. And what do you want your legacy to be?
Oh gosh, well, I have goals. I am committed to expanding my work as a coach. I for two reasons. One, because I personally gain a tremendous amount of meaning and purpose and energy and gratification from that work. And I feel like there's a great need for human beings in general to be able to have a space in their lives where they stop and they think, and they are listened to, and they're seen, and they have a safe space to explore what is possible for them. And so much of us, our lives go by so fast, and we're just zipping from one thing to the next, that I think that there's a great need for that. And it can be very, very profound work when it's done well. So kind of in a short-term sense, that's a goal of mine. But when you talk about legacy, I think for me, one of the underlying themes that connects so much of what I do, especially in the last decade and going forward, is to hold space for more complex realities, to make it okay for people to, in our industry specifically, to not adhere to these kind of very streamlined narratives about what success looks like, what happiness looks like, all of that, to debunk some of the stories that we tell about successful folks, like successful folks are happy, or if you're in the Boston Symphony, you are a better musician than someone who's not in the Boston Symphony, which I think is a load of hogwash. Yeah. And you know, there's so many ways in which we put people in boxes, assign value to folks, simplify our understanding of human nature, and especially I think in the music world, there's so much need and opportunity to open that up, to make room for more complexity, to make room for lots of different people, a lot of different stories, a lot of different paths. And so if I can do my part, both by supporting people as they go through this themselves, but also by modeling it in my own career and the way that I interact with people, then that I think is one of the legacies that I hope to leave.
And lastly, what are some books that are favorites of yours and that have kind of stuck with you for the long haul?
Oh, well, I have two that I'll share. One is kind of a more coaching related book, and one is just a pleasure book. It's a series of books. So for pleasure, it's been a handful of years since I've read these, but they just consumed me, which were the Neapolitan novels by Elena Ferrante, who's a pen name, but these are these novels that follow. Have you read these books?
I haven't read it yet. I have it. I've bought the book.
There's four of them. So the first one starts with My Brilliant Friend, and then it goes on from there. And there's four of them. They're long, they're dense. I think what I love about them, I mean, there are many things I love about them, but they are a portrayal of a friendship between two girls that is so complex and honest, and at times very dark, and it doesn't paper over things or make things oversimplified, and it describes friendship in a way that I found to be incredibly compelling and really rare. So I loved those books for again the author's capacity to describe human nature in a lot of richness and depth. So those were a great joy. If you're not as much of a reader but are interested in them, there's a mini series. HBO is producing a mini series that I think they've already covered the first two, excuse me, maybe the first three of the volumes, and it's exquisite. It is so beautiful. The cinematography is really extraordinary too. So if you decide not to dig into the books, you can always do it that way. And then, you know, a book that I read a number of years ago and have reread since and have recommended to countless people who have then recommended to countless people is this book called Playing Big by Tara Mohr, M-O-H-R. And it's not playing big in a musical way, it's playing big in life. And there's especially some incredibly valuable insights about feedback, about receiving feedback specifically, and how to learn how to navigate that and manage that are incredibly valuable for all human beings and musicians especially. It's written for women. However, I think it's universally relevant and of value to all sorts of folks. And I've recommended it to all sorts of folks who have found it to be really helpful. And I return to it very regularly. I think she's one of the more insightful thinkers out there about human nature. And she has a particular insight combined with warmth that I find really appealing. So I love that book. I recommend it all the time.
Maybe the book club is next for you, Elizabeth's book club.
I have a book club. So in my your tenure team program, we have it, but we're running a book club within the program. It's so exciting, and it's an asynchronous book club. So everybody's reading whatever they want, but we share insights with each other about what we're reading, which is such a great way to get inspiration for maybe your next book that you would like to read, or to just it's a beautiful way to kind of make connection again around some shared learning and some shared experiences, but we're all grown up, so we can read what we want.
Well, thank you so much for your time and for being here. It was really great chatting with you, and it was a pleasure getting to know you.
Thank you. It was such a great time to speak with you as well. And I wish you all the best. And thank you so much for having me.
You're very welcome. Bye, Elizabeth.
Bye.